Today's story is about a man named Brandon, who unexpectedly found himself in a battle with a corrupt homeowners association that tried to swallow up his family's lake cabin. A simple property dispute escalated into trespassing, threats, and fierce legal showdowns. Brandon's journey is filled with real grit and determination, and I'm excited to share it with you. So, buckle up, and let's dive in. HOA officers broke into my lake house, but I restrained them and called the police. My name is Brandon, and the story I'm about to tell is the fight I had to protect my grandfather's cabin by Blackwood Lake. For as long as I can remember, this cabin has been the spiritual heart of my family. It's where we came together for holidays, where we shared laughter around a crackling fireplace, and where we found solace whenever life got messy. I want you to picture the cabin the way I see it. A cozy, single-story wooden retreat built in 1957 by my grandfather, who was a proud carpenter and an even prouder family man. He hammered every nail himself under the sweltering summer sun. My grandmother, back when she was alive, told me how he had spent weeks living out of a tent on the property, clearing the land by hand just to pour the foundation. He believed that if you were going to do something, you had to put your whole soul into it. And trust me, that cabin has a soul. Growing up, I spent weekends there with my parents. We'd wake up to the smell of pine trees and that cool morning dew blanketing the grass outside. My dad would take me fishing at dawn, teaching me how to cast a line properly. Elbow in, wrist relaxed, a gentle flick of the arm. I still hear the splash of the lure hitting the water and feel the thrill of anticipation. Sometimes we caught a few trout for dinner. Sometimes we just got bites. It didn't matter. It was the ritual that mattered. That bond between father and son made stronger with each sunrise over the lake. When my grandfather passed away, he left the cabin to my dad. My dad was never one to talk about feelings, but it was clear he was proud to hold onto that legacy. He respected my grandfather's wishes, maintaining the place exactly as it was built. Same wood paneling, same simple layout, same small dock by the water. He even kept the same old wooden rocking chair on the porch, where my grandfather used to sit with a steaming mug of coffee at dawn. It was a time capsule of the 1950s, but for us it was timeless. Then my father passed, and the cabin came to me. I remember the day I got the call from the lawyer, informing me that the deed had officially transferred to my name. It was bittersweet, knowing I'd carry on this family tradition, but also realizing how final it all was. I'd lost my father, just like he had lost his, but the cabin remained, standing firm against the passage of time. Though I live in the city for work, an hour's drive away, I make it a point to visit the cabin as often as possible. Every Friday afternoon, I'd pack my duffel bag, hop in my truck, and leave behind the daily grind. As I made the trip up the winding roads surrounded by towering pines, I felt a wave of calm wash over me. The city can be suffocating sometimes. Car horns and neon signs, phones ringing off the hook. But the cabin? It's the opposite. There's only the rustle of leaves, the calls of distant loons on the lake, and the reassuring creak of old floorboards that have known countless footsteps. For me, this cabin isn't just a structure. It's my heritage. I'm proud of it. When I'm there, I feel connected to something bigger than myself. It's where I imagine my grandfather's spirit lingers, watching over the land he shaped. It's also where I feel closest to my dad, remembering all the father-son talks we had under the night sky, a small bonfire crackling between us. In so many ways, the cabin is a living memory of the men who came before me. But, as I learned, not everyone appreciates history and tradition. Some see land and immediately think of how to exploit it, turning forested beauty into subdivisions, historic cabins into new developments. I never expected that this family treasure would become the battleground for one of the worst nightmares I've ever faced. Greed has a way of sneaking in when you least expect it, and unfortunately, mine showed up in the form of the Silver Pines HOA. It all started innocently enough. One crisp autumn morning, I pulled into the cabin's gravel driveway. It was early October. The leaves were just starting to show their fiery colors, and I was looking forward to a quiet weekend of reading old novels by the fireplace and maybe fishing one last time before the lake started to chill over. I remember parking my truck and stepping out, inhaling that sweet, pine-scented air. felt like I was stepping into a postcard. But something was off. I noticed motion in the distance. Two figures were loitering in the clearing around my property line. At first, I thought they might be hikers who'd veered off the trail. This area attracted the occasional wandering adventurer. As I got closer, though, I saw that these weren't casual hikers. They had laser measuring tools, clipboards, and wore the kind of business casual attire you'd see at a corporate meeting. One of them, a tall guy with slicked back hair and a grin that made my skin crawl, introduced himself as Ronald. He claimed to be the president of the Silver Pines HOA. The other man, short and wiry, was introduced as Albert, who Ronald described as their compliance inspector. Ronald held out a piece of paper like it was a royal decree and started talking a mile a minute about updated boundaries and newly annexed land. My stomach did a little flip at the mention of annexed, and I listened carefully, trying to make sense of his rapid-fire claims. He said something about how the local county had redrawn property lines and that my grandfather's cabin just so happened to fall under the jurisdiction of Silver Pines Estates, an HOA that governed a newer development about a mile south of Blackwood Lake. Ronald insisted that they were simply doing their duty by ensuring all properties within their domain met the community's aesthetic standards. He rattled off demands: fresh paint job in an approved color palette, lawn maintenance to align with their guidelines, a specific fence style if I wanted any additional structures. The list went on, bureaucratic jargon swirling in the autumn breeze. I remember standing there, eyes narrowed, listening to his speech. I was torn between confusion and indignation. My cabin was built in 1957, long before there was any talk of a fancy subdivision named Silver Pines. As far as I knew, we were in an unincorporated part of the county. We'd never been part of any HOA. We were just a small plot of family land by the lake. I said, "I think you're mistaken. This property has been in my family for generations. There's no HOA here." But Ronald flashed that smug grin again, tapping his folder. "It's all in the documentation," he insisted. Albert, the so-called compliance inspector, stood there scribbling notes on a clipboard, occasionally pointing his laser measuring device at my porch as if he was measuring the angle of the railing. It felt invasive, like I was an exhibit at some carnival sideshow. I told them flat out, "This cabin's not changing for anyone. You need to leave my property." Ronald, still smiling, simply said I'd be receiving official documentation soon, then motioned for Albert to follow him back to their vehicle. As they left, I stood there with a tightening knot in my gut. I'd never dealt with an HOA before, but I'd heard horror stories. People being fined for having the wrong color mailbox, or for letting their grass grow an inch too high. The idea that they could waltz in and claim my property was part of their domain seemed impossible. Yet that morning, with crisp leaves crunching underfoot, reality started sinking in. This was just the beginning. A few days after that unsettling encounter, I found a formal-looking envelope in my mailbox back in the city. Sure enough, it was from the Silver Pines HOA. The letter laid out an extensive list of violations that, in their words, required immediate correction to bring the cabin up to their standards. My jaw dropped as I read the bullet points. Unauthorized exterior paint color. They insisted the cabin should be painted in one of their approved earth tone shades. Non-compliant landscaping. I apparently needed to replace the natural grass and wildflowers with standard turf or approved decorative shrubs. Structure not meeting community architectural standards. They wanted me to change the cabin's siding to something more uniform, among other ridiculous modifications. At the bottom of the letter, it stated that failure to comply within 30 days would result in escalating fines and potential legal action. They had the gall to attach a preliminary fine schedule. Even glancing at the numbers, I felt my blood pressure spike. They were threatening thousands of dollars in penalties for every single so-called infraction. It took everything in me not to laugh at the absurdity. Instead, I crumpled the letter, marched over to my living room fireplace, and tossed it in. The flames ate it up in seconds. But as satisfying as it was to watch that letter curl and blacken, I knew it wouldn't make the problem disappear. Burning their notice was a gesture, an emotional purge, but the threat remained real. I decided to take a more proactive approach. I hopped in my truck and drove straight to the county assessor's office. I needed clarity. This idea of redrawn boundaries that magically put my cabin under HOA control smelled fishy. When I arrived, I met a clerk named William, a weary-looking man in his 60s who seemed perpetually buried in paperwork. His desk was stacked with files, but he welcomed me politely, asking how he could help. I explained the situation, gave him the property address, and waited while he typed into his computer. After a few moments, William said, "Well, it looks like there were some recent changes to the local planning maps. According to these records, your parcel was included in the Silver Pines expansion zone." He adjusted his glasses and peered at the screen. The official date of the annexation was about 3 months ago, but it's been in discussion for nearly a year. I asked if I could reverse it. William shrugged apologetically. "You'd have to contest it through the courts. Unless you have definitive proof that there was some procedural error or fraud, it can be an uphill battle. Not cheap, either." That's when my frustration turned into full-blown anger. How could they do this behind my back without even notifying me in a clear, proper manner? I gave William a nod of thanks, then left the office, my mind already racing with the next steps. I called my cousin Ashley on the drive back. She's a real estate attorney and one of the most determined people I know. Ashley listened carefully while I ranted about what happened. She calmly told me to send her every piece of documentation, letter, and photo I had. "I'll look into it," she said. "But if they did everything by the book, even if it was done quietly, this won't be a simple fix. We should be ready for a legal showdown." I spent that evening installing a series of security cameras around the cabin. My gut was telling me that Ronald and his cronies weren't done yet, and I wanted proof if they pulled any more stunts. I placed a camera in the trees near the driveway, another by the porch overlooking the lake, and a couple with wide angles covering each side of the cabin. Late into the night, I tested them one by one, ensuring I'd catch any suspicious activity. Sure enough, I didn't have to wait long. The next round of intimidation came quicker than I expected. Within days, the fines started piling up. Every time I checked my mailbox, there'd be a new letter with some inflated penalty. Ronald had apparently fast-tracked this into an all-out attack, hoping I'd fold under the pressure. But what they failed to understand was that this wasn't just a piece of real estate to me. It was a part of my identity, my history. If they wanted a war, I was ready to fight. The harassment escalated around midnight one cold evening. I was asleep when my phone buzzed. The new security system had sent a motion alert. Bleary-eyed, I reached for my phone and opened the app. The live feed showed 3 figures dressed in dark clothes, stealthily moving across my property. My heart hammered in my chest as I watched them measure lengths of my porch and snap photos, occasionally shining flashlights against the cabin walls. They taped a large notice on the front door, all while whispering among themselves, like a band of thieves. My adrenaline surged. In the city, it might take time for law enforcement to respond, but here in the countryside, I had my own way of dealing with trespassers. I jumped out of bed, grabbed my shotgun, unloaded, but visually intimidating, and rushed outside, flicking on the porch lights. The second the floodlight hit them, I hollered, "Get the hell off my property." The men froze. One of them dropped his clipboard with a clang against the porch steps. They spun around to face me, and I recognized the voice of one who stammered, We're just enforcing HOA compliance." He was shaking, clearly not prepared to be confronted. I didn't budge. "I told you before, this land isn't yours. You step foot here again, and I'll have the sheriff on your backs. Now get out." I'm not a violent person, but the rage I felt in that moment was enough to put real steel in my voice. They scrambled off, muttering curses under their breath. One of them let slip, "You'll regret this," as they hopped into a pickup and sped away. The next morning, as if to add insult to injury, I found another letter taped to the cabin door. It was a list of fines that had soared to astronomical figures. 30 grand in total. Unauthorized structure, $10,000. Landscaping violations, $2,500. Non-conforming exterior, $5,000. And more smaller, itemized fees that stacked up like bricks in a wall of intimidation. It was grotesque. I tore the letter to pieces right then and there. But that wasn't the worst part. Less than an hour later, I heard a rumble of a truck engine from down the road. Two men hopped out, dragging a massive wooden sign. They hammered it into the ground right in front of my porch. Painted in bold letters were the words, "Future site of Silver Pines Clubhouse." If steam could have come out of my ears, it would have in that moment. I didn't wait or argue. I went straight for the sign and yanked it out of the ground, splinters digging into my palms. I threw it aside, refusing to let them desecrate my property with their false claim. Moments later, Ronald pulled up, looking calm and collected, wearing a crisp shirt and that same slimy grin. He gestured to the men, who were ready to replant the sign, but I blocked them. Ronald's tone was sweet, condescending. "We know this is stressful, Brandon, but let's be rational. We're willing to offer you a generous buyout to make this all easier." Then he quoted a figure that, while not insignificant, was insulting in the grand scheme of what this cabin meant to me. He acted like this was just a business transaction, a matter of money exchanging hands. But he didn't understand. This wasn't just real estate. This was my family's legacy, my childhood memories, my father's laughter echoing in the woods. It was the place my grandfather had poured his sweat into. No amount of money was going to make me walk away. I let him know in no uncertain terms. "I'm not selling. Not now, not ever. And if you or your goons trespass again, I'll have the sheriff involved." Ronald's grin flickered, and he walked back to his SUV, muttering something to his men before driving off. If it hadn't been obvious before, it was crystal clear now. They were determined to take my land, and I would have to fight them every step of the way. Things took a darker turn when I decided to run some errands in town one evening. I was only gone a couple of hours, picking up groceries and hardware supplies. As I turned onto the gravel driveway, my headlights caught the unnerving sight of my front door swinging ajar. My stomach clenched. I'd locked that door before leaving. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Had thieves targeted the place? Was it HOA stooges pulling another stunt? I parked and cautiously approached, calling out, "Hello? Anyone there?" No response. Inside, the cabin was wrecked. Furniture overturned, cushions torn, kitchen drawers pulled out and contents strewn across the floor. My heart sank when I saw my grandfather's old rifle case smashed open and the rifle missing. But the real gut punch came when I spotted the bright red spray paint slashed across the living room wall. In huge letters, it read, "This isn't your home anymore." The words dripped with the kind of hatred that made my blood run cold. The cabin had always been a place of warmth and love, and seeing such violent vandalism felt like a personal assault on my family's heritage. My anger flared, and my hands shook as I rushed to check the security camera footage. I had a small monitor set up in the back room. Sure enough, the cameras captured 3 masked men forcing the door open. They tore through the cabin in a methodical frenzy. They seemed to know exactly what they were looking for. Documents, personal items, anything of value. One rummaged through the study. Another yanked open the rifle cabinet. They moved with purpose, like they had a plan. But luck was on my side. One of them briefly turned his head toward the camera, lifting his mask just enough to reveal his face. Albert, the so-called compliance inspector from the HOA. My heart pounded with a mix of fury and validation. They had crossed every line imaginable. Fueled by adrenaline and rage, I grabbed my shotgun, still unloaded, but they didn't need to know that, and sprinted out into the yard. I could see them fleeing toward the tree line, dark silhouettes under the moonlight. Without thinking twice, I roared, "Stop!" They turned around in panic. 2 of them vanished into the thick brush, but the third guy stumbled over some exposed tree roots. He went sprawling face-first into the dirt. I closed the distance in seconds. I'm not a trained fighter, but anger has a way of sharpening your instincts. I tackled him, pinning him down with all my strength. He thrashed, cursing, trying to reach for something in his pocket, but I wrenched his arm behind his back. The only thought in my mind was protecting my family's home. When I yanked off his mask, it wasn't Albert. It was some other HOA goon I vaguely recognized from the prior trespassing incidents. He spat and snarled, but I didn't ease off. I dragged him onto the porch and used rope from the tool shed to tie his hands together. My mind was spinning, part disbelief, part cold fury. Then I grabbed my phone and called Sheriff Frank, a local lawman who'd earned a reputation for integrity and no-nonsense policing. Frank arrived in less than half an hour, lights flashing, stepping out of his cruiser with a calm but purposeful stride. He looked the captive up and down, then glanced at me. I explained everything, showed him the security footage, the vandalism inside. Frank kept his face impassive, but I could see his jaw clench. He turned to the man I'd caught and said, "You have the right to remain silent." Then he led him to the cruiser, reading off the rest of the Miranda rights. When Frank finished, he looked at me and shook his head. "This is serious, Brandon. They really did a number on the place." He didn't say it, but I could tell he understood how personal this felt. How it wasn't just about property damage, but the violation of something sacred to my family. We spent the rest of the night combing over the scene. Frank took pictures, I gave a statement, and the suspect sat in the back of the cruiser, glaring at me through the window. Despite my anger, I couldn't help but feel a flicker of relief. We had them dead to rights. We had footage of their break-in, and we had one of them in custody. This wouldn't magically fix my cabin, but it was a turning point. A line in the sand had been crossed, and now law enforcement was fully involved. By the next morning, the story was the talk of our small community. The break-in, the vandalism, the identity of the trespasser. People whispered about it over breakfast at the local diner. Sheriff Frank wasted no time. He knew this wasn't just a random burglary. It was orchestrated, connected to the ongoing harassment I'd been dealing with. Between the security footage, my eyewitness account, and the suspect in custody, Frank was confident he had enough to seek a search warrant for the Silver Pines HOA office. When he called me saying he'd secured the warrant, I felt a surge of gratitude. "You want to come along?" he asked. "You might want to see this." I didn't hesitate. I hopped into my truck and followed his cruiser to the HOA's headquarters, a small yet tastefully designed building perched at the entrance to the Silver Pines subdivision. It was meant to impress prospective buyers with manicured landscaping and an elegant sign. We arrived mid-afternoon. Frank and several deputies parked out front, forming a small procession as they walked to the entrance. I trailed behind, adrenaline coursing through my veins. We found the door unlocked, so Frank pushed it open and stepped inside, the warrant clutched in his hand. The place smelled like fresh coffee and office supplies. At a large conference table sat Ronald and his board members, apparently in the middle of a meeting. They all turned in unison as we burst in. Frank strode forward, voice echoing in the open space. "Sheriff's office. We have a warrant to search these premises." He laid the official document down on the table with a solid thump. Ronald tried to look unbothered, standing slowly, arms crossed over his chest. "What is the meaning of this?" he asked, his voice dripping with indignation. I stayed near the door, letting Frank do his job. But I couldn't resist adding, "We have security footage of your men breaking into my cabin, Ronald. One of them is in custody right now." My words hung in the air, each of Ronald's board members glancing around with unease. Ronald tried to bluff. "You have no proof it's connected to us," he sneered. But Frank simply nodded to one of his deputies, who held up a copy of the footage on a tablet. There, paused on the screen, was Albert's face as he lifted his mask, plus the other suspect rummaging through my living room. Ronald's facade cracked, and I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. "Ronald," Frank said calmly, "you're under arrest for conspiracy, trespassing, harassment, and property fraud." Before he could protest, a deputy stepped forward with handcuffs. Ronald's composure dissolved into desperate protests. "You can't do this," he yelled. "We're a reputable organization. I have rights." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. 2 deputies took him into custody, and another read him his rights. While Ronald was let out, more deputies fanned out through the office, rifling through filing cabinets, computer records, and stacks of documents. They confiscated a slew of questionable paperwork, maps with suspicious boundary changes, internal memos instructing board members to pressure certain homeowners. There were references to expansions, buyouts, and intimidation tactics. A whole chain of emails laid out how they planned to rope in properties like mine that weren't originally part of the HOA. Albert was nowhere to be seen, but Frank had an arrest warrant for him too. I heard over the police radio that they picked him up at his house later that afternoon. As the search continued, it became clear that the Silver Pines HOA had been running a well-orchestrated scheme to annex properties quietly, then harass or intimidate owners into compliance or forced buyouts. Ronald was the mastermind. Albert was his enforcer, and they had a small crew of hired thugs who did the dirty work. Deputies carted out boxes of evidence, labeled them, and loaded them into vehicles. The board members, most of them at least, looked shell-shocked. They might have known about the shady dealings, but it seemed like only a handful were involved in the actual break-ins and physical intimidation. Still, ignorance wasn't going to protect them from liability, and they'd soon face legal scrutiny for turning a blind eye. Frank took me aside at one point, placing a hand on my shoulder. "This is a big break," he said. "Your security footage was key. Once we tie the property records to those break-ins, it's game over for these guys." I felt a sense of vindication wash over me. It didn't erase the damage done to my cabin or the violation I felt, but it was a clear victory. For the first time in weeks, I felt a weight lift off my chest. The men who tried to bully me off my land, the land my family had cherished for generations, were now facing justice. In the weeks that followed, the legal system ground forward. It wasn't overnight, but the evidence against Ronald and the other conspirators was airtight. They had broken multiple laws, from falsifying property boundaries to orchestrating home invasions. The county prosecutor brought charges of conspiracy, fraud, trespassing, burglary, and more. Ronald ended up taking a plea deal, which still led to a substantial prison sentence, though not as lengthy as it could have been if he'd gone to trial. Albert and the hired goons also faced multiple felony charges. Some took pleas, others fought in court and lost. The judge's ruling regarding my property was swift and conclusive. My land had been illegally annexed. The boundary changes that had slipped through the administrative cracks were declared void. Any claim Silver Pines HOA had tried to stake on my cabin was nullified. Not only that, but the HOA was ordered to pay restitution to me for the damages to my cabin and to other homeowners who had been victimized. The county council initiated an internal review to prevent such manipulations from happening again. As news of the scandal spread, Silver Pines estates began to unravel. Home values in the development plummeted. Banks grew wary of offering mortgages in an area tainted by fraud. Several residents who had been subject to excessive fines or similar intimidation demanded refunds or sued. With the core leadership behind bars and finances drained by legal battles, the HOA effectively collapsed. I wish I could say I took satisfaction in watching their empire crumble. Truthfully, I felt a complex mix of relief and lingering anger. Relief that my cabin and the memories it held was protected. Anger that my peace had been torn apart by greed in the first place. Still, I made sure to direct my energy toward rebuilding rather than nursing resentment. I spent many days repairing the damage inside the cabin. The front door was replaced, new locks installed, the furniture put back in place. I scrubbed the vile spray paint off the walls, though it took multiple coats of primer and paint to fully erase the hateful message. Every time I lifted a brush or hammered a nail, I thought of my grandfather, how he built this place with love and determination. I imagined he'd be proud to see me fighting to keep it intact. One evening, about a month after the arrests, I sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey in hand. The sun was setting over Blackwood Lake, casting purple and orange hues across the water. The pine trees swayed in a gentle breeze that rustled their needles in a soothing hush. My cousin Ashley pulled up in her truck, stepping out with a big grin. She'd just come from a meeting with the prosecutor's office and had good news. The restitution checks had been finalized, and the final nails were driven into the coffin of the Silver Pines HOA. "You did it, Brandon," Ashley said, walking up the creaking porch steps. "You really did it. They're done for good." I took a long sip of whiskey, letting the smoky warmth settle in my chest. Then I gave a small nod. "Damn right I did. And I couldn't have done it without you, Frank, and a little bit of old-fashioned stubbornness. We stood there in companionable silence for a moment, watching the lake. There were no more looming threats, no more trespassers lurking in the shadows. I thought of my father and grandfather, both gone but never forgotten. Their spirits were in the wind that rattled the pine branches, in the worn floorboards beneath my feet, in the very walls that gave this place shelter. In the quiet hush of twilight, I felt peace return to the cabin. It was mine, as it always had been, safe, unassailable, a testament to family legacy and the power of perseverance. I knew I'd never take that for granted again. No one was going to take my home away from me, not while I still drew breath. Greed can be loud and brutal, but determination backed by truth can silence it. My cabin still stands by the lake, as it has for decades, and I plan to keep it that way for many more. And that's the story. Brandon's unshakable determination against a corrupt HOA that tried to snatch away his family cabin. It took courage, legal grit, and a little bit of good old-fashioned stubbornness to protect what was rightfully his. In the end, justice prevailed, and the crooked organization crumbled under the weight of its own greed. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Tailstrom. We hope you found Brandon's journey as riveting as we did. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to join us next time. Until then, take care and never back down from fighting for what truly matters. We'll see you next time on Tailstrom.